We often think smart strategy, it's all cooked up in modern boardrooms. But what if the ultimate guide was actually written like thousands of years ago? Today, we're digging into Sun Tzu's Art of War. And forget the dusty relic idea. This is really about unlocking some surprisingly relevant insights on competition, strategy,
Yeah,
well, getting ahead in almost anything.
exactly. And the version of the Art of War we're looking at today is great because it's not just the core text. It's got all this historical context, commentary from scholars over centuries.
Mm.
It really adds depth.
Absolutely. So for everyone listening in, our mission, let's call it, is pretty straightforward. We want to understand where the art of war actually came from, get a grip on some of its foundational ideas, and figure out why it's still such a big deal.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, getting the core wisdom without the overwhelm.
Yeah, exactly. Your fast track. Okay, so let's start with the big question. Who was Sun Tzu? Was he even real?
Right. Well, the earliest place we find him mentioned is in Sima Qian's Shiqi. That's a foundational Chinese history text. And it says Sun Tzu, or Sun Wu, as he's also known, served King Holu of the Wu Kingdom. This was around the late 6th, early 5th centuries BC.
So pretty specific timing.
Yeah. And the Shiqi credits him with being involved in some major military wins, like capturing Shu, advising on attacking Ying, which was the capital of Chu. Important stuff.
So seems like a real historical figure then.
Yeah.
Involved in big events, working for a known king. But does the story just end there?
That's the thing. The Shiqi doesn't really say much about him after King Holu's time. It kind of seems like he didn't outlive his boss, who died around 496 BC.
Okay.
And that lack of later detail, that's part of why his actual existence has become, well, a subject of debate.
Right. This is where it gets really interesting, doesn't it? This whole debate about whether Sun Tzu was one person or even existed at all. Why are some historians skeptical?
Well, a major point of skepticism comes from a scholar named Ye Shuixin. He points out something pretty significant. Sun Wu is completely missing from the Tzuchuan.
And the Sichuan is.
It's a really detailed historical record from the spring and autumn period, exactly when Sun Tzu was supposedly active. It's generally considered very reliable.
Okay, so it covers the right time period.
Right. And Yu Shuisen's argument is basically, this book mentions tons of figures, even relatively minor ones. So how could it just completely miss a military genius like Sun Wu if he was as influential as the Shiqi suggests?
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
A big silence in a key source.
It is. It's a significant omission.
But like you said, Sima Qian and the Shiqi seems pretty convinced he was real. How do we square that?
Well, Sima Qian was known for being a pretty careful historian, so his belief carries weight. He lists Sun Wu alongside other famous military figures of the era.
Okay.
And then there's another piece of evidence from the Han Shu. It's a later bibliography, and it lists an entry for the works of Sun Tzu of Wu in 82 Peak Ian, which means chapters, with diagrams in 9 Xuan.
Whoa, 82 chapters. That's way more than the 13 we usually see in the Art of War today.
Exactly. It suggests that the book we know might just be, part of a much larger body of work that was attributed to him back then.
So what could those extra chapters have been? Any theories?
One idea is that maybe later writings got added on over time. Or, possibly, it included something like a Q&A, maybe records of discussions between Sun Tzu and King Holu.
Ah, like an exegesis or commentary?
Sort of. There's another text, the Wu Yo Chan Shu. It has some legendary elements, mind you. But it describes King Holu questioning Sun Tzu chapter by chapter, being really impressed. If those conversations were written down and maybe expanded upon, that could account for the larger number of chapters the Han Shu mentions.
Interesting. So maybe the 13 chapters we have are the core, the original kernel of wisdom, and the rest was elaboration or maybe lost.
That's one possibility, yeah. Or maybe some was apocryphal, added later. It's hard to know for sure.
Okay, so putting aside the extra chapters for a moment, what about dating the 13 chapters we do have? When were they likely written?
Well, Sima Qian said they were already well known in his time, which was the 2nd century BC. But if we look inside the text itself, there are clues.
Internal evidence. Like what?
There are a couple of passages that specifically mention the rivalry between the states of Wu and Yu. For instance, one part talks about Yu having more troops than Wu. Another uses an analogy about people from Wu and Yu helping each other in a boat during a storm.
Okay, Wu and Yu.
These references suggest the text was written during a time when Yue had become a major rival, maybe the major rival, to Wu.
Right. But how does that fit with the timeline from the Shiqi? You said Sima Qian placed Sun Tzu earlier when Chu was the main enemy.
And that's the puzzle.
Yeah.
The Shiqi puts Sun Wu's service before Chu's big defeat in 506 BC. But the 13 chapters don't mention Chu at all, only Yu.
Huh.
So the internal evidence points to a period after 506 BC when Yu really rose as a threat. This creates a bit of a conflict with Sima Qian's account, or at least the traditional interpretation of it.
So even figuring out the when involves some strategic thinking. Okay, let's try to bring this together. What's the general consensus among scholars now? Who was Sun Tzu, and when did The Art of War likely get written?
I'd say the prevailing view now is that while we might never know the exact life story of a single person named Sun Tzu,
Right.
the 13 chapters we call The Art of War most likely originated with a real military expert, someone living in the late spring and autumn period, probably around the 5th century BC.
So the text itself feels authentic to that period.
Yes, it reflects practical military knowledge from that era, even if the author wasn't, perhaps, widely famous at the time, which could explain why the Sanshan is silent. The work itself seems grounded in the realities of warfare back then.
Okay, that makes sense. So regardless of the author's exact identity, we've got this incredibly influential text. Let's dive into the core ideas. What makes it so timeless? Where do we even start?
A good starting point, maybe the most famous line, is, all warfare is based on deception.
Deception. Okay, what does that mean in practice? Is it just about lying?
It's much broader than just lying. It's a fundamental strategic principle. Sun Tzu gives examples like, when capable, feign incapacity, or when active, inactivity.
So appearing weak when you're strong.
Exactly. Or making the enemy think you're far away when you're actually close, and vice versa. It's about constantly creating a gap between what the enemy thinks is happening and what's really happening.
Like misdirection, creating a blind spot for your opponent.
Precisely. It's about controlling their perception to gain an advantage. It underpins so much of the other advice.
Okay, got it. What's another major principle that stands out?
The huge emphasis on speed and avoiding long, drawn-out wars.
Right, protracted campaigns are bad.
Sun Tzu is very clear.
Uh,
Long wars drain the state's money, they blunt the army's weapons, they lower soldier morale.
and crucially, other rivals might see you're weakened and decide to jump in.
Yes. He points out that while we hear about stupid haste in war, you basically never see cleverness associated with prolonged operations. The goal is decisive, efficient action.
Get in, get it done, get out before the costs mount up. That sounds pretty relevant to, well, almost anything competitive today, like business.
Absolutely. Think about companies that move quickly, launch products faster, adapt faster, they often win. It's the same principle. Act decisively before resources run dry or competitors catch up.
So it's not just winning, but winning smartly and efficiently. What did Sun Tzu consider the highest form of victory then?
This is really interesting. He believed that supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting.
Winning without fighting. How does that even work in war? Seems like a contradiction.
It's about strategy trumping brute force. It means using planning, intelligence, diplomacy, psychological pressure, maneuvering your opponent into a position where fighting seems futile or disadvantageous for them.
So you outsmart them before the battle even starts.
Essentially, yes. Maybe you cut off their supplies, isolate them diplomatically, undermine their morale, or present such a strong position that they realize they can't win. It's about achieving the objective, neutralizing the threat, without the cost and destruction of actual combat.
That's a powerful idea. Okay, so smart strategy is key. Sun Tzu also lays out what he calls the 5 essentials for victory. What are those?
Right, these are like 5 critical conditions. First, knowing when to fight and when not to fight.
Okay, judgment.
Second, knowing how to handle different force sizes, your own versus the enemy's. Third, having an army that's unified, from the soldiers to the commanders, all working together.
Unity of purpose.
Fourth, being prepared yourself while catching the enemy unprepared. And fifth, having military commanders who have the capacity to lead without constant interference from the ruler or sovereign.
Ah, that last one seems really important. The relationship between the political leader and the general.
It is. Sun Tzu suggests the sovereign sets the overall goal, the strategy, but the general needs the freedom to make the tactical decisions on the ground based on the evolving situation. Too much meddling from afar can be disastrous.
Like a CEO setting the vision but trusting the managers to execute.
Exactly that kind of dynamic.
Makes sense. Another huge theme is knowledge, right? Knowing the enemy and knowing yourself.
Absolutely fundamental. He says something like, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles.
Wow.
But If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. And if you know neither, well, you're basically guaranteed to lose every time.
So that knowledge is the bedrock.
Yeah.
How does it translate into action?
Knowing the enemy, their strengths, weaknesses, plans, disposition allows you to attack their vulnerabilities. Knowing yourself, your own capabilities, limitations, resources allows you to choose the right strategy, whether that's attacking or defending, and ensures you don't, bite off more than you can chew.
Self-awareness is key to not overreaching. Okay. Let's talk about Cheng and CHI. These terms come up a lot. What are they?
Right, Cheng and CHI. You can think of them as the direct and the indirect methods, or the orthodox and the unorthodox.
Okay, direct and indirect.
Cheng is the conventional force, the expected move. It's what you use to engage the enemy, to fix them in place. CHI is the unconventional, the surprise element. It's often the maneuver that actually achieves the victory.
So you need both.
Yes, they're not separate things, they're intertwined, they constantly transform into one another. Sun Tzu says their combinations are endless, like the colors of the rainbow. You use the direct to engage, but you win with the indirect.
Can you give an example? You mentioned Han Xin earlier.
Yeah, the commentator Tu Mu uses Han Xin's campaign against Lin Xin. Han Xin made a big show of marching his main force directly towards the enemy, Xie Chen, but secretly he sent a large detachment on a difficult, unexpected route using makeshift rafts to cross the river, CHI. They popped up where the enemy least expected them and won the day.
Ugh. The classic feint and flank, misdirection again.
Exactly. Keep the enemy guessing, never let them settle.
Okay. What about attacking weak points? It seems obvious, but how does Sun Tzu frame it?
He uses a great analogy. Water. Water naturally avoids high places and flows downwards to low places.
Right.
Military strategy, he says, should be the same. Avoid the enemy's strengths, their strong points, their high ground, and attack their weaknesses, their gaps, their vulnerabilities, like water finding the path of least resistance.
So it requires careful observation and analysis of the terrain, the enemy's setup.
Absolutely. And crucially, adapting your tactics. Just as water shapes itself to the ground it flows over, a good general adapts their strategy to the specific enemy and situation. There's no single fixed plan that works every time.
Adaptability. That seems to be a constant theme. You also mentioned maneuver turning disadvantage into advantage. How does that work?
Skillful maneuvering, for Sun Tzu, is about changing the situation in your favor. It could mean taking a long, circuitous route to arrive before the enemy who took the direct path, achieving surprise. Or turning a difficult situation, like difficult terrain, into an advantage.
Like the examples of crossing the Alps.
Precisely. Hannibal, Napoleon, they undertook incredibly difficult marches through the Alps, something their enemies thought impossible. By doing the unexpected, they gained a massive strategic advantage. They turned a disadvantage the terrain into the element of surprise.
You're using the unexpected again. What about the human element? Morale, spirit?
Oh, hugely important. Sun Tzu calls it spirit, or qi, a different qi from the tactical one. He observes that an army's spirit is keenest in the morning.
Yeah.
By noon, it starts to flag, and by evening, soldiers are thinking about going home. So a clever general avoids attacking an enemy when their spirit is high, like early in the day or when they've just won a victory. Instead, you attack when they're sluggish, tired, demoralized.
Timing your attack based on their psychological state.
Exactly. Manage your own army's spirit and exploit the fluctuations in the enemy's.
Interesting. Okay, another slightly counterintuitive piece of advice. When you surround an enemy, leave them an escape route. Why do that?
It sounds odd, right? But the idea isn't necessarily to let them get away clean. It's psychological.
How so?
Well, as some commentators explain it, you make him believe that there is a road to safety. If an enemy feels completely trapped with no way out, they'll fight with the courage of despair. They have nothing left to lose.
Cornered animals fight hardest.
Right. By leaving an apparent escape route, you lessen that desperation. They might try to flee rather than fight to the death, which can make them disorganized and easier to defeat. He also warns against pressing a retreating or desperate foe too hard for the same reason. Don't push them into finding unexpected courage.
It's about managing their psychology even when they're losing. Okay, The Art of War also talks about the 9 situations. What's that about?
These are basically 9 different types of ground or strategic circumstances you might find yourself in. It's a framework for analyzing your environment.
Like different battlefield conditions.
Yeah, things like dispersive ground, which is when you're fighting near your own territory, so soldiers might be tempted to slip home.
Right.
Or facile ground, easy terrain you've just entered, all the way to hemmed-in ground where escape is difficult and desperate ground where you must fight to survive.
And does he offer advice for each?
Yes, for each situation, he outlines the appropriate psychological focus or tactical response. On dispersive ground, for instance, focus on unity. On contentious ground, strategically vital ground, hurry up your rear guard so you don't get cut off. It's about recognizing the situation and adapting your leadership and tactics accordingly.
A kind of situational playbook. Very practical. Okay, one last big area. Spies. He dedicates a whole chapter to them.
And he considers intelligence absolutely critical. He says it's essential for leaders to know the enemy's situation, and you get that information primarily through spies.
He even categorizes them, right?
Yes, into 5 classes. Local spies, using people from the enemy's district. Inward spies, using enemy officials. Converted spies, enemy spies you've turned. Doomed spies, giving false info to your own spies you expect to be captured to mislead the enemy.
Wow, doomed spies. That's ruthless.
It is. And finally, surviving spies, the ones who come back with actual intelligence. He argues that using all 5 types skillfully makes you basically invincible because you know everything.
That's an incredibly developed view of intelligence gathering for ancient times. And he stresses treating them well.
Immensely. He says spies should be the most intimately treated, most generously rewarded people in the whole army because the information they provide is invaluable, but also absolute secrecy is vital.
Makes sense.
He even says if spy secrets leak prematurely, the spy and whoever they told should be put to death. That's how high the stakes are for intelligence.
Yikes. Okay, so it's this incredibly rich system of strategic thought, covering deception, speed, knowledge, psychology, terrain, intelligence. Now let's bring it back to our listener, the learner. How does all this ancient military strategy connect to life today? It's not like most of us are commanding armies.
Right, and that's the fascinating part, isn't it? The principles are surprisingly adaptable. Think about business strategy. Deception could be your market positioning or how you negotiate. Knowing your enemy is competitor analysis. Knowing yourself is understanding your company's strengths and weaknesses.
Exploiting weaknesses,
Yeah.
speed to market, planning. It all translates.
Absolutely. Project management, that's about navigating terrain, managing resources, anticipating problems. Even personal interactions, understanding the other person's perspective, choosing when to push and when to hold back, that's strategic thinking. The core ideas, planning, adaptability, understanding the dynamics of competition, minimizing costly conflict, they apply almost anywhere.
And the whole debate about Sun Tzu's identity is maybe a lesson, too, about questioning sources and understanding that knowledge often has layers.
Exactly. It encourages that critical thinking, looking beneath the surface of information.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what are the main things we should take away from The Art of War?
Well, I think first, it's this incredibly rich text, probably rooted in the real military experience of the 5th century BC, even if the author's story is murky. Second, its core principles are about smart strategy, understanding the whole picture, using deception wisely, knowing yourself and your opponent, valuing speed and efficiency, and crucially, aiming to win by outmaneuvering the opponent, ideally without destructive conflict.
And for you listening, the value is getting this foundational toolkit for strategic thinking. It's applicable way beyond the battlefield to your career, projects, maybe even just navigating daily life. It's about thinking smarter about competition and challenges.
So, maybe a final thought to leave with everyone. Think about a challenge you're facing right now. How could Sun Tzu's idea of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting apply? Is there a more indirect path, a way to change the dynamic so confrontation isn't necessary?
Something to chew on. Which of these ancient ideas resonates most with your modern world? Maybe this dive makes you want to pick up The Art of War yourself. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.